You could say my life was one of those picture-perfect suburban setups, the kind that neighbors envy and Instagram celebrates. But let's be real, perfection is just a well-polished lie. I was about to find that out the hard way. Hi, I'm Emily Carter, 31, living in a charming little house on the edge of Bend, Oregon. I share it with my husband, Liam, and his father, Mr. Anderson. From the outside, our lives are what Hallmark movies are made of. Liam's a software engineer with an easy laugh and a strong jawline, the kind of guy every mom hopes her daughter marries. Mr. Anderson, retired military, is the family's rock, with his calm demeanor and a knack for fixing everything, both literally and metaphorically. Me? I'm the ambitious one, a marketing manager with dreams of climbing higher than the glass ceiling would comfortably allow. Sounds great, right? Except, beneath the cozy layers of family dinners and Sunday hikes, there was a gnawing emptiness I couldn't ignore. Let me paint you a picture of our mornings. Liam's already up, his coffee cup half empty on the counter as he types away at his laptop. Mr. Anderson's at the kitchen table, newspaper spread out, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. And me? I'm somewhere between pouring oat milk into my cereal and fighting the urge to scream into the void. Don't get me wrong, I love my career. It's where I shine. Pitching ideas to clients, closing deals, brainstorming campaigns, that's my stage, my spotlight. But coming home feels like walking off that stage into a dimly lit backstage area where no one's waiting. Liam's always preoccupied with work or the latest Netflix series. Mr. Anderson tries his best to mediate when things get tense, but even he can't mend what's fraying between us. It's the baby issue, you see. Liam's ready for the pitter-patter of little feet. I'm not. I mean, how can I bring a kid into a world where I can't even figure out my own happiness? Every time we talk about it, it spirals into a circular argument, Liam insisting it'll complete us, and me countering that I'm not ready to lose myself in diapers and sleepless nights. Mr. Anderson, bless him, always says the same thing. You two need to listen to each other more. Family's about understanding, not winning. His words are wise, sure, but they're easier said than done. Our home reflects this unresolved tension. The living room is tastefully decorated, yet the air feels heavy, like we're all holding our breath. My office upstairs is my sanctuary, filled with colorful post-its, awards, and a vision board plastered with career goals. Liam's space is the garage, where he tinkers with old computers like some modern-day mad scientist. Mr. Anderson's domain is the backyard, where he tends to his rose bushes and birds with a quiet focus that's almost enviable. One Sunday, I remember standing at the kitchen sink, watching Mr. Anderson through the window. He was pruning the roses, his face calm and focused. Liam came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You okay?" he asked softly. I wanted to say yes. Instead, I said, "Just tired." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Liam didn't push. He just kissed my shoulder and let me be. And in that moment, his love felt more like an obligation than a connection. Then there was that evening 2 weeks ago. We were having dinner, the three of us, talking about nothing and everything. Mr. Anderson mentioned how he'd fixed the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. "It's the little things that keep a house standing," he said with a chuckle. I wanted to retort, "What about the little things that keep a marriage standing?" But I bit my tongue. Instead, I nodded and smiled, because that's what you do when you're spiraling in silence. That night, as Liam snored softly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning lazily overhead. I thought about my life, my marriage, my ambitions. Was I selfish for wanting more? Or was I just trying to hold on to the pieces of myself that felt like they were slipping away? What I didn't know was that this undercurrent of dissatisfaction, this crack in my so-called perfect life, was about to split wide open. And the person who'd drive a wedge into it wasn't Liam. It wasn't even me. It was someone I least expected. But I'll save that for later. For now, let's just say that sometimes the people who seem to hold your world together are the very ones who can pull it apart. To tell the truth, The moment wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was ordinary, mundane even. But the thing about life is it loves to throw curveballs when you least expect them. It happened on a Wednesday. Liam had just left for a work event, and I was in the middle of finishing a report for an upcoming marketing pitch. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. Mr. Anderson was in the living room, reading some historical biography. I could hear the occasional rustle of pages turning, a sound so regular it felt like a metronome ticking in the background. I decided to take a break and grab a snack. As I walked into the kitchen, I realized my dress zipper was stuck halfway up my back. I tugged at it awkwardly, twisting and turning, but it refused to budge. Frustration bubbled up as I tried to reach the zipper from another angle, only to drop my spoon with a loud clatter. "Emily? You okay in there?" Mr. Anderson's voice was calm, but carried enough concern to make me pause. "Yeah," I called out, my tone more flustered than I intended. "Just a wardrobe malfunction." I heard the floor creak behind me as he stepped into the kitchen. "Need help?" he offered, setting his book on the counter. Instinctively, I hesitated. But after another failed attempt to yank the zipper up, I sighed and nodded. "If you don't mind. It's really stuck." He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant. Standing behind me, he reached for the zipper. His fingers were strong but careful, tugging gently to avoid tearing the fabric. For a moment, I stood frozen, hyper-aware of the space between us, or lack thereof. "Looks like it's caught on the lining," he murmured, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, warm against my skin, and it made my pulse quicken in a way that startled me. "There," he said after a faint click. "All set." I turned to face him, grateful but uneasy. "Thanks. I really appreciate it." He smiled faintly, his eyes studying me for a beat longer than necessary. "No problem," he replied, his tone light. But something lingered in the air between us, a tension I couldn't quite place. I busied myself with pouring a glass of water, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to focus on anything but the strange weight of the moment. Mr. Anderson returned to the living room without another word, but his presence seemed to echo in the room long after he'd left. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop replaying the interaction in my mind. It wasn't just the closeness, it was the way it made me feel, like something had shifted ever so slightly, but significantly. When Liam came home that evening, I tried to act normal. I asked about his event, laughed at his jokes, even curled up next to him on the couch while we watched TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that brief moment in the kitchen, the feel of his father's hands, the unspoken undercurrent that had passed between us. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of awkwardness, a misinterpretation of a simple gesture. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed, and though I couldn't quite put my finger on it, I felt its presence, looming like a shadow I couldn't shake. And that shadow was about to grow larger. The days that followed were riddled with a strange kind of static, like the air before a thunderstorm. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that the moment in the kitchen had been nothing more than an odd blip in an otherwise ordinary relationship. But the subtle changes were impossible to ignore. It started small. When I'd come downstairs in the morning, Mr. Anderson would look up from his paper just a fraction longer than usual, his eyes lingering on me before he offered his usual polite nod. At first, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, but then there were the silences. One morning, as I poured coffee, I could feel him watching me from across the room. It wasn't the kind of watching that makes you feel safe, like someone looking out for you. No, this felt charged, like there were words he wanted to say but couldn't or wouldn't. "Good morning," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady but low. I glanced at him briefly, and that was a mistake. His gaze met mine, and there was something there, something I couldn't name, but felt down to my core. I quickly turned back to my coffee, the heat of his stare staying with me long after I left the kitchen. Around Liam, everything stayed the same. He was as easygoing as ever, joking about work and teasing me about my obsession with organization. But even as we talked, I found myself hyper-aware of Mr. Anderson whenever he was in the room. The way he'd sit quietly on the armchair, his eyes occasionally flicking toward me during conversations. The way he'd pause slightly when I entered the room, as if he was recalibrating himself in my presence. One evening, I decided to address the tension head-on. Well, sort of. It was after dinner, and Liam was upstairs on a call. Mr. Anderson was on the porch, tending to one of the bird feeders he'd recently set up. I grabbed a dish towel under the guise of cleaning up and stepped outside. "The birds seem to like those feeders," I said, trying to sound casual. "They do," he replied without looking at me. His hands were steady as he refilled the small wooden structure. "Especially the finches. They're picky eaters." I stood there, twisting the towel in my hands, debating whether to say more. When he finally turned to me, I froze. His expression was unreadable, a mix of calm and something else I couldn't quite place. "Everything okay, Emily?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. The question caught me off guard.
"Yeah."
Why wouldn't it be? He shrugged, but there was a weight to it. "You've seemed distracted lately." "I've just been busy with work," I lied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." He didn't respond immediately, just nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine for a moment too long. Then he turned back to the feeder, as if that brief exchange had been enough. But it hadn't been enough for me. I walked back inside, my heart pounding, every nerve in my body on edge. By the time Liam came downstairs, I'd already set the table for tea and was flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading. Mr. Anderson joined us shortly after, his demeanor as calm as ever, but I could feel the tension lingering in the room like a ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work. I stayed late at the office, volunteered for extra projects, even started running again just to exhaust myself into numbness. Anything to avoid being in the same space as Mr. Anderson for too long. But avoidance isn't a solution, it's just a delay. And as much as I tried to keep things normal, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, I caught him watching me again, this time as I cleaned up after dinner. Liam had gone to the garage to fix something, leaving the two of us alone in the kitchen. I could feel his eyes on me as I scrubbed the plates, my back to him. "Emily," he said, his voice low. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. "Yeah." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. "Nothing," he finally said. "Never mind." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I finished the dishes in silence, the weight of his unspoken words pressing down on me with every passing second. Later that night, lying next to Liam in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was feeling anymore. Fear, curiosity, guilt, or some twisted combination of all three. All I knew was that something was building, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending it wasn't there. The confession came out of nowhere. One moment, I was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through my emails with a cup of chamomile tea. The next, Mr. Anderson was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, hands shoved deep into his pockets like he was holding himself together by sheer willpower. "Emily," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I glanced up, already sensing something was off. "What's up, Mr. Anderson?" He took a step into the room, his eyes fixed on the floor. For a man who usually carried himself with unshakable composure, he seemed uncertain. Vulnerable, even. It made me sit straighter, a knot forming in my stomach. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steady but strained. "And I hope you'll hear me out." My first instinct was to joke, to break the tension that was already suffocating. But the look on his face stopped me cold. "Of course," I said cautiously, setting my phone aside. He exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly as he ran a hand through his neatly combed gray hair. "You might have noticed, things have been a little tense around here." I forced a small laugh. "Yeah, I've picked up on that." His lips twitched like he wanted to smile, But it didn't come. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at the darkened yard. The faint glow of the porch light highlighted the lines on his face, lines that seemed deeper tonight. "When you came into this family, I thought I'd seen it all," he said, his back still to me. "I'd been through war, loss, raising a son. But you brought something different. You reminded me of things I hadn't thought about in years." My breath caught in my throat. This was heading somewhere I wasn't ready for, somewhere I didn't want it to go. "I admire you, Emily," he continued, finally turning to face me. His eyes locked on mine, and the weight of them made my skin prickle. "Your ambition, your resilience, the way you keep this family going even when things get tough. It's rare." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Thank you," I murmured, unsure of what else to say. He stepped closer, and I instinctively leaned back in my chair. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said quickly, his tone earnest. "But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something." The room seemed to tilt, the words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My stomach churned as I tried to process what he'd just said. "Mr. Anderson," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's wrong," he interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. "I know you're my son's wife, and I have no right to feel this way. But I do, and it's been eating at me." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. My voice faltered, the words tangled in my throat. "This is not okay." "I'm not asking for anything," he said, his hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. I needed you to know. I couldn't keep it inside anymore." His words hit me like a freight train, and I felt my pulse racing, my breath shallow. "Why would you tell me this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Because it's the truth," he said simply, his gaze steady. "And I've always believed that family deserves honesty, even when it's messy." The irony wasn't lost on me, and I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me flailing in free fall. I stepped back, shaking my head. "This can't happen. Whatever you think you're feeling, it's not real. It's proximity or something else. But it has to stop." "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll keep my distance if that's what you need." But I couldn't let it fester in silence anymore. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I turned away, unable to look at him any longer. "I need to think," I said, my voice cracking. "Please just don't say anything to Liam." "I won't," he promised, his voice a hushed echo. I left the room in a daze, my mind a chaotic mess of confusion and guilt. My feet carried me upstairs, where I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide and wild. Who was this woman staring back at me? What kind of person was I to have let things get this far? I wanted to blame him, to pin this entire mess on his shoulders. But deep down, I knew I wasn't innocent. I'd felt the tension too, hadn't I? I'd noticed his lingering glances, his quiet presence, and instead of shutting it down, I'd let it grow. For the first time in a long while, I didn't trust myself. And that scared me more than anything he'd said. The decision came to me in the middle of the night, like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't stay here. Not with this weight pressing down on me. Not with Mr. Anderson's words looping endlessly in my mind. If I didn't leave, this tension would consume me, and worse, it might destroy Liam, the one person I couldn't bear to hurt. But leaving wasn't just a matter of packing a suitcase. It required careful planning, subtle adjustments. I needed to make it look like a move for the good of the family, not an escape from the cracks forming beneath the surface. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, the sky outside still a deep, bruised purple. Liam stirred beside me, mumbling something incoherent before turning over. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the faint hum of his breathing, my chest tightening with the weight of what I was about to do. At breakfast, I floated the idea, keeping my tone light and practical. You know, I began, stirring sugar into my coffee. I've been thinking, what if we started fresh somewhere else? Maybe closer to the city. There'd be more opportunities for both of us. Liam frowned, his fork hovering over his plate. Closer to the city? I thought you loved it here.
I lied. Forse na smile.
But it feels stagnant. Don't you think? We've been in this same rhythm for years. A change might be good for us. Mr. Anderson, seated at the head of the table, looked up from his newspaper. His gaze lingered on me for a second too long before he returned to the sports section without a word. Liam shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. I guess it could be worth considering, he said, taking a sip of his orange juice. We can look into it. That was the opening I needed. Over the next few days, I began researching neighborhoods, scouring real estate listings, and dropping casual mentions of apartments and job prospects. Liam didn't seem particularly invested, which worked to my advantage. I needed to be the one driving this change. But every step felt like walking through quicksand. At work, I found myself distracted, staring blankly at my computer screen as thoughts of the house and its suffocating energy consumed me. At home, I avoided Mr. Anderson as much as possible, keeping interactions brief and polite. Still, I could feel his presence like a shadow in every room. One evening, while Liam was out meeting a friend, I caught Mr. Anderson alone in the living room. He was sitting in his usual chair, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the muted television. I hesitated in the doorway, my instinct to flee warring with the need to address the elephant in the room. Mr. Anderson, I said, stepping in cautiously. Can we talk? He looked up, his expression guarded but calm. Of course.
Sit down.
I perched on the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I think it's best if Liam and I move. It's not about what you said, I added quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. It's just time for a change. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. If that's what you need, Emily, I won't stand in your way. The softness in his voice surprised me, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This man, flawed as he was, had been nothing but supportive in his own way. But I couldn't let that stop me. It is, I said, my voice firmer now. I hope you understand. I do, he replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. I'll miss having you here, but you're right. Maybe this is for the best. I left the room with a knot in my chest, torn between relief and something that felt uncomfortably close to regret. As the weeks went by, the plan began to solidify. I found a promising apartment closer to Portland and started putting feelers out for job transfers. Liam remained indifferent, trusting me to handle the details, which only added to the weight on my shoulders. How could I tell him the real reason we were leaving? How could I explain the gnawing guilt, the fear of what might happen if we stayed? The closer we got to finalizing the move, the harder it became to keep my emotions in check. Every glance from Mr. Anderson felt like a question I couldn't answer, every casual touch from Liam a reminder of the secrets I carried. One night, as we lay in bed, Liam turned to me, his voice groggy but curious. You're sure this is what you want, Em? I mean, we've built a good life here. I hesitated, staring at the ceiling. It's what we need, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't press further and I didn't elaborate. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if leaving would solve anything. But staying? Staying would destroy me. The conversation that sealed it happened on an overcast Saturday, the kind of day where the clouds hang low and the air feels heavy with things unsaid. Liam had gone out to run errands, leaving Mr. Anderson and me alone in the house. I'd been avoiding moments like this for weeks, but it seemed fate wasn't going to let me sidestep it any longer. I was in the kitchen, packing a box of things I decided to donate, when he walked in. He leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his expression unreadable. I hear you've found a place, he said, his voice even but carrying the weight of meaning beneath the surface. I paused, gripping the edge of the box.
Yeah.
I signed the lease yesterday. He nodded slowly, taking a sip from the coffee mug he held. And Liam's on board with this? He's supportive, I said, carefully choosing my words. He trusts my judgment. For a moment, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of birds outside. Then he set his mug down with a soft clink and turned to face me fully. "You're doing the right thing, Emily," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't feel that way now, but you are." I blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected endorsement. "You think so?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This house, it holds a lot of good memories. But it also holds tension. Strain. Maybe it's me, maybe it's the past, maybe it's a mix of things. But I've seen the way you've been lately. The way Liam looks at you, wondering what's wrong but not asking. This isn't the place for you anymore." His words hit like a hammer, knocking loose emotions I'd tried to suppress. I wanted to argue, to tell him he wasn't the reason I felt this way. But deep down, I couldn't deny that he was right. "It's not just about the house," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It's about me." About us. I felt lost. And I think a change is the only way to fix that. "I know," he said simply. "That's why you need to go. Start fresh somewhere else." There was no accusation in his tone, no trace of the tension that had lingered between us since that night in the kitchen. Just a quiet understanding that felt almost like forgiveness. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The weight of his support, of his acknowledgement, was both comforting and overwhelming. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my throat tight. "For everything. For whatever part one played in." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Emily," he interrupted gently, his voice steady. "You don't owe me an apology. Life is complicated. People are complicated. What matters now is that you're doing what's best for you and Liam." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I murmured, and I meant it. He gave me a small, sad smile and picked up his mug again. "You'll let me know if you need help with anything before the move?" "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He left the kitchen after that, and I stood there for a long time, staring at the half-filled box on the counter. His words had given me clarity, but they'd also left me with a hollow ache I couldn't shake. This house had been my home for years. It had been the place where I built a life, where I loved and fought and dreamed. But now, it felt like a relic of a past I couldn't cling to anymore. When Liam came home later that day, I told him we should set a move-out date. "The sooner we get settled, the better," I said, trying to sound casual. "Sure," he agreed, leaning down to kiss the top of my head. "You're the boss." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. As much as I wanted this move, as much as I needed it, part of me couldn't help but wonder what I was leaving behind. That night, I lay awake, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. Liam slept soundly beside me, blissfully unaware of the storm inside my mind. Across the hall, Mr. Anderson's light was still on, a faint glow spilling under the door. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of finality. The decision was made, the path set. But as I stared at the ceiling, one thought haunted me. Would leaving truly be enough to outrun everything I was trying to escape? Or was I taking the storm with me? The day we moved was unremarkable. Gray clouds hung low in the sky, casting a muted light over the house as Mover shuffled boxes into the truck. Liam, ever the optimist, was already chatting about how he'd set up his office in the new place, oblivious to the quiet storm churning inside me. I stood in the doorway, gripping the keys tightly in my hand. The house felt empty now, stripped of the furniture and decor that had made it a home. What remained were the shadows of memories, both joyful and suffocating, lingering in the corners like ghosts refusing to leave. Mr. Anderson came to the door, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried that same weight I'd grown used to seeing. "This is it," he said softly, as though speaking any louder would shatter the fragile moment between us. I nodded, my throat tight. "Thank you for everything," I managed, though the words felt insufficient. He gave me a small smile, his lips barely curving. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. Just take care of yourself. And Liam." The way he said it, so simple, yet so full of meaning, cut through me. I felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief, as though I'd been released from something I hadn't realized was holding me captive. "I will," I said, and I meant it. The drive to Portland was uneventful, though my mind was anything but. Liam hummed along to a playlist he'd thrown together, occasionally glancing at me with a warm smile. I returned it each time, though it never quite reached my eyes. Leaving the house had been necessary, but it felt like I was leaving pieces of myself behind, both the good and the bad. I kept replaying moments in my mind, the quiet mornings in the kitchen, the laughter over dinners, the tension that had grown like ivy, winding its way through the cracks. When we arrived at the new apartment, I was struck by how unfamiliar it all felt. The walls were a clean white, the floors unscuffed, the air sterile. It was everything I'd thought I wanted, a blank slate. But as I stood in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by boxes, I realized how much of myself was still tied to the past. Later that night, after Liam had fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the tiny balcony. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a sharp contrast to the quiet nights we'd left behind. I gripped the railing, letting the cool air sting my cheeks as I stared out at the unfamiliar skyline. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel everything. The guilt, the loss, the relief, the hope. It came in waves, crashing over me and receding just as quickly. I thought of Mr. Anderson, of his words on that final day. "Take care of yourself."
And Liam.
They weren't just pleasantries. They were a reminder. A plea, perhaps. Family isn't just about love. It's about responsibility, about choosing each other even when it's hard. And I'd failed in that. But failure wasn't the end. It couldn't be. I thought about the mistakes I'd made, the lines I'd let blur, the feelings I hadn't confronted until it was too late. I thought about Liam, so steady and trusting, so willing to follow me without question. I didn't deserve his faith, but I'd been given it nonetheless. As I stood there, the realization settled over me like a weight and a comfort all at once. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn from it. I could be better, not just for Liam, but for myself. When I finally went back inside, the apartment felt a little less foreign. It wasn't home yet, but it could be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. I crawled into bed beside Liam, careful not to wake him. As I stared at the ceiling, I made a silent promise to myself. I would let go of the shadows, the tension, the guilt. I would focus on what mattered. The life we were building, the person I wanted to become. And maybe, just maybe, this fresh start would be the beginning of something good.